Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Abdullah Hayek. He's an independent Middle East analyst and consultant based in Washington, D.C. He is also a Middle East History and Peace Fellow with Young Voices. Today, I'm going to be talking to Abdullah about his recent piece on Israel and Syria. Abdullah, tell our viewers what is happening between the two countries.
It was nothing short of a geopolitical earthquake, and it was an up and down scenario. In late May and early June of this year, Israel and Syria were in the middle of peace talks secretly, and it was an unprecedented step after years of hostilities. Multiple reports indicated that they were on the verge of a historic agreement that would eventually normalize relations between them by the year's end. And the new Syrian president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, who actually led the offensive that toppled the previous president, Bashar al-Assad, in December 2024, was quietly pursuing rapprochement with Israel via Emirati and American mediated channels. And this diplomatic momentum raised hopes, especially as US President Donald Trump wants to expand upon the Abraham Accords. He wants to expand his status as a peacemaker. He met with Ahmed al-Sharaa in May in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and he declared that he would lift sanctions there, and he eventually did on June 30th as a goodwill gesture. And both sides, Israel and Syria, appeared cautiously optimistic, with Israel's government signaling openness to a deal so long as its security and its safety, especially control of the Golan Heights, was assured. However, that optimism collapsed in mid-July when a sudden eruption of violence in southern Syria derailed the peace drive. On July 11th, sectarian clashes exploded in the Suwaida province in southern Syria, which is a Druze majority region near the Golan Heights, near the Jordanian border as well. The trouble began when a Druze young man was kidnapped and beaten by Bedouin gunmen at a makeshift checkpoint, and the incident was laced with sectarian insults and physical injuries. Within days, this quarrel spiraled into a widespread armed conflict, and by July 13th, Druze militias and Bedouin tribesmen were battling in Suwaida city and the surrounding villages. This prompted Syrian government forces under Ahmed al-Sharaa, to deploy to Suwaida to restore order. But instead of acting as neutral peacekeepers, some units were accused of siding with the Bedouins and committing atrocities against Druze civilians. And within a matter of days, the death toll quickly climbed to the hundreds, and almost 200,000 civilians were displaced amidst the chaos. And what started as an internal Syrian sectarian dispute has more or less ballooned into a crisis that drew regional and international attention. This is where Israel comes in. It quickly inserted itself into this volatile situation. Prime Minister Netanyahu, positioning himself and Israel as the protector of the Druze brethren across the border, warned that he would not tolerate Syrian military movements that threaten Druze communities near Israel. And on July 14th, the Israeli Air Force launched a wave of airstrikes against Syrian military units in Suwaida, ostensibly to protect the Druze and enforce a demilitarized buffer zone by the Golan Heights. Now, these strikes rapidly escalated, and by July 16th, Israel had conducted over 160 airstrikes, with the climax of it striking the heart of Damascus itself, the Ministry of Defense, by the popular Umayyad Square in the heart of Damascus, and even the Syrian presidential palace. 3 people were reported killed in those blasts. Other raids targeted the Syrian army's headquarters. This was the first time since the Assad regime's fall that Israel directly attacked Syria's new government on such a scale. uh, basically shattering the nascent trust built during those negotiations. Now, in August, Israel and Syria find themselves in a precarious standoff that instead of being on the cusp of peace, they are still tense after a month of near war. Now, the Suwaida conflict, which was short, but it was halted by an uneasy ceasefire brokered under American pressure. Washington intervened, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio taking a lead role, but really the effort was spearheaded by the U.S. envoy to Syria and U.S. ambassador to Turkey, Tom Barrack. Tom Barrack basically shuttled diplomatically between the sides, and with Jordanian and Turkish participation, a July 17th ceasefire was struck in which Syrian forces would withdraw from Syria and halt the fighting. And Sharaa basically pulled back his army to avoid an all-out war with Israel. But in the aftermath, Druze militias exacted, brutal revenge on the Bedouin communities, and reports emerged of massacres and summary executions on both sides of the sectarian divide. Now, the humanitarian toll of all of this is staggering. By mid-July, on the day of the ceasefire, actually, nearly 600 people were dead. And a few days later, the death toll rose to over 1,000, and then to 1,200. So it was such a high death toll for such a short period of time. It included dozens of civilians and military personnel, irregular military personnel, on both sides. It was all done through sectarian killings. Entire villages, entire neighborhoods lie in ruin. And this sparked international attention. Russia and Iran have condemned Israel's intervention. The Arab League has called for de-escalation, and even the US has urged Israel to show restraint after initially backing its ally. But as of now, peace talks are frozen, and they're replaced by, I would say, it was safe to say that it's mutual recriminations. And Israel insists that its strikes were a necessary response to Syrian ethnic bloodletting, let's say, while Damascus accuses Israel of sabotaging Syria's stability and violating its sovereignty. So I think, in short, the hopeful dialogue of early May and June has been overtaken by the military confrontation and deep distrust resulted by the end of July, and Syria's internal strife spilling across the border and dashing prospects for a near-term peace deal. I think that's very far-fetched to say what the next step is going to be.
So you've given a really in-depth overview of the kind of violence happening in the region. You say that Syria and Israel came close to a peace deal, and you've spoken about multiple chains of events happening with internal unrest, Israel's reactions, and global reactions. But why do you think the peace deal really fell apart? And what do you think someone was out there to ensure that the peace deal doesn't happen?
I think we have to go back to June. Reports emerged that Syria and Israel were very close to a historic peace accord. Credible outlets within Israel, such as Israel's I-24 News and others, reported that both governments were on track to sign a deal before 2025, at the end of 2025, marking the most significant direct talks in decades. And, Sharaa was eager to end Syria's isolation, and still is. And he looked to a peace pact, as a gateway to reconstruction and legitimacy and stability. I would say that unprecedented negotiations unfolded quietly via back channels for many reasons. The first would be that it's still early to declare it publicly due to the political tensions within both sides. But, for example, Israel's National Security Council head, Zakai Khanibni, supervised secret meetings with Syrian officials to discuss security coordination and countering Iranian influence. But by early July, insiders spoke of a possible interim arrangement, even an idea to transform the contested Golan Heights into a so-called peace park. And President Trump lifted the sanctions to encourage Damascus to go towards that deal. And the diplomatic momentum seemed unstoppable. But in reality, the violence really undermined the peace process. And what I would say really killed the peace initiative was Israel's overwhelming military response. Israeli warplanes struck hard on 3 consecutive days, on July 14th, the 15th, and the 16th. Wave after wave of Israeli airstrikes hit Syrian positions, with the strike on Umayyad Square at the Ministry of Defense being caught on live TV. This, expanded pounding of high-value targets in Damascus really struck the peace deal and made it, foregone for a while. To conclude on that question, I would say who is to blame? I think that both sides are to blame. Israel's aggressive intervention dealt the final blow to the peace effort, but also the Syrian government's lack of control over its military also has a role to play. The sectarian clashes in Syria were the initial spark, but also leading to that, Israeli airstrikes, 160, and even targeting the government's presidential palace, that more or less irreparably poisoned the atmosphere. And from a Damascus perspective, that was a betrayal. Syria had entered talks in good faith, only to be bombed at the first sign of trouble. And, I would say heavy-handed actions like these on part of the Israeli military really shattered expectations of a speedy peace process. And it really plunged those two neighbors who have been at war for almost a century back into almost open confrontation. But, Israelis blame that Damascus itself killed the deal by failing to prevent sectarian violence, highlighting the al-Sharaa government's inability or willingness to control extremist factions within his ranks, who did commit massacres, many massacres. And that breakdown of that order gave hardliners in Israel an opening to strike. And within Netanyahu's coalition and the government, especially in the Knesset, they were very open to striking Damascus, as they are openly hostile to any compromise with Damascus. But ultimately, it was Israel that pulled the trigger, and it prioritized military force over further dialogue. So the result is that both sides' hard-won trust has been destroyed. But I don't think the peace talks are immediately fizzled out. I think there is still room to reopen those talks. Of course, both sides need to be reasonable, and they need to put the military aspect of diplomacy on the side for a while.
Abdullah, you've spoken about the Israeli offensive in Syria. You've also told our viewers about what happened in Syria. But can you elaborate more on the sectarian violence and why that could have been the spark which actually drew Israel into bombing Syria?
The momentum came to a screeching halt once the Suwaida clashes erupted between the Druze and the Sunni Bedouin in Suwaida. The sectarian clashes that began in July 11th weren't really there since July 11th. The Druze and the Bedouin in southern Syria had always been in tension, in hostility. There isn't that much of an example of coexistence between the both sides. The fighting itself was really horrific. After the initial Druze young man's kidnapping and beating, tit-for-tat abductions are what led to the firefights, open firefights, urban warfare on July 13th. and they rapidly escalated into full-blown communal warfare. And many eyewitnesses and many social media accounts showed us how Druze villages were shelled and how Bedouin villages were displaced, homes were torched, sectarian killings spread fear. And by the time the Syrian government moved in, the death toll was mounting. And the conflict had a life of its own. I think the eventual escalation of these events really just opened up old wounds that have been sizzling over a low fire for quite a while. And when I say quite a while, it's been decades. And the army's involvement, with its lack of control over the entirety of its military, it added fuel to the fire. Local Druze essentially accused Syrian security forces of brutality and even extrajudicial executions. The London-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported that scores of civilians were summarily executed during raids in those days. And like I said earlier, within a week, we had 600 people dead, and 3-4 days after that, it rose to about 1,000. And 200,000 people were displaced. This kind of intense sectarian warfare really deals a severe psychological blow to many things. First of all, it's the internal social unity fabric within Syria. Syria is basically a nation reborn. There's a new government, a new president, a new system in its entirety. And it's led by a group that previously had, extremist background. Ahmed al-Sharaa is known to be, or used to be, was a part of al-Qaeda, and then Jabhat al-Nusra, and then Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. That raises a lot of eyebrows for many in the Syrian community's minorities, especially the Alawaites, the Druze, the Kurds, the Christians. The second thing that the psychological blow was to the notion of peace with Israel. It revived old animosities. It made Syrians more suspicious of their government to engage with Israel. And, it also made the Israelis doubt Syria's stability as a partner. And I would say that the numbers, the aftermath of it all make it very plain. Hundreds of deaths, dozens of villages scarred, and Damascus bombed. These outcomes were just a death blow to the peace process. And I think the sectarian strife, especially that I have to mention, it was reported that 83 out of 154 Druze civilians killed in execution by the security forces of the Syrian government. That was the major, escalating factor that led to the eruption of everything. So I think, in summary, the sectarian clashes in Syria didn't just shatter a momentum; they reversed an entire trajectory, not just on a bilateral peace process manner with Israel, but also on how the Syrian minorities and all other groups look at their own government right now. So a lot has happened and a lot has changed, and quite frankly, it's going to be very slow to move forward with that momentum right now.
Let's talk about Israel. If you Google Israel, or you look up any news about Israel, it's either about Iran or their military campaign in Gaza. There's absolutely very less mention about ceasefire talks with Syria. Why do you think it was kept so quiet?
They were kept extremely low profile, I think, by design for several important reasons. I think both governments had strong incentives to negotiate behind closed doors, given the sensitivity of the issues and the political risks involved. First, we have to consider Syria's side. President Shara's new administration is fragile. It has emerged from the ashes of the Assad regime. It has emerged from the ashes of a brutal 13-year civil war. Opening peace talks with Israel, which is the arch nemesis of the region, not just of Syria, is a politically explosive move in the Arab world, especially within Syria, and especially with, as you mentioned, the war in Gaza. And Shara did face backlash from various quarters, hardline Islamist factions within his own coalition, remnants of the Assad regime military factions that are operating throughout Syria. Iran-backed militias in neighboring countries are vehemently opposed to that. Many in his country do not want it, also on the public civilian level. And to avoid derailing the process before it even began, Damascus opted to keep the dialogue secret until concrete results could be shown and made public. And indeed, when rumors did surface, Syrian state media basically dismissed reports of a pending peace deal as premature and false. That happened, I believe, on July 2nd. This was a deliberate strategy and sign to tamp down public expectations and criticism. And historically, Syrian leaders, especially Bashar al-Assad and his father Hafez al-Assad, have feared being accused of selling out or giving up the Golan Heights or betraying the Palestinian cause. So it's really an Assyrian political tradition that any negotiation with Israel has to be handled out with utmost secrecy and care. Now, from Israel's perspective, there too were strong reasons to keep things out quietly. For one, Israel has insisted that its sovereignty over the Golan Heights is a non-negotiable issue, a stance that could potentially provoke immediate controversy domestically and especially within the Knesset if made public early. Within Israel, if word got out that Benjamin Netanyahu was talking to al-Sharaa, Israeli hardliners and right-wing opposition political figures might demand clarity on whether Israel was considering territorial concessions, and potentially that will fracture the ruling coalition within the Knesset. And by keeping these talks secret, Netanyahu had room to explore options without any immediate public scrutiny. Additionally, Israel was dealing with a very unusual counterpart. As I mentioned, Syria's al-Sharaa is formally associated with al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a US designated terrorist organization, all three of them, and openly negotiating with a regime that is partly composed of ex-jihadists will be politically toxic for Netanyahu in Israel. So Netanyahu pursued a back-channel route, especially through the US and the UAE, to test the waters discreetly. And another factor I would say from an Israeli standpoint is the multitude of spoilers that could derail talks if they become public. This would ignite Iranian and Hezbollah retaliation. There are already talks within Israel that the reason why October 7th happened is that they can derail a potential normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So for an Israeli standpoint, if they get too close to normalization with Syria, that might potentially, ignite Iranian or Hezbollah renewed attacks on Israel. So I think in summary, they were kept quiet to give them a chance to succeed. As I mentioned, multiple factors like domestic politics, fear of spoilers, fear of attacks, and the need to build initial trust all dictated discretion. So I think only when that effort really in secret shows potential, shows hopes that actually they can grow upon it. Uh, they can, slightly show the public and the media that they're engaging with each other. But when something like what happened in Sueda in July, that's never going to happen. So I think that's why they kept it secret in a nutshell.
But do you think Israel even wanted peace in the first place? I mean, many would argue that they were stalling out the talks so that they could expand control over Golan Heights and enlarge the buffer zone that they already have in Syria.
Well, to be honest, in the beginning, Israel appeared interested in peace, but on its own terms, very much so. And it prioritized basically its strategic military interests, its security interests above all else. Um, it engaged seriously in the peace talks, yet it simultaneously took actions that suggest it was hedging its bets and basically consolidating control on the ground. There's a duality to Israel's approach. On one hand, Israel had genuine incentives for a peaceful arrangement, stabilizing its volatile northern border, preventing a power vacuum in Syria from being filled by Islamist jihadists, and even gaining a diplomatic win by adding Syria to the expanding circle of Arab-Israeli normalization under the framework of the Abraham Accords. And indeed, Israeli officials were reportedly optimistic about a deal so long as it guaranteed Israel's security demands. For example, the foreign minister Gideon Sa'ar said in late June that he was open to normalization with Damascus, provided Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights was unequivocally recognized and non-negotiable. This shows that Israel wanted peace, but only if Syria essentially accepted the status quo of Israel's territorial control. In the reports that were revealed by I-24 and various other Israeli media outlets, the proposed deal would include that Syria would get a form of peace and possibly some economic benefits. But as I said, Israel would keep the Golan, and perhaps dressing it as part of a shared peace park, which not a lot of details were revealed on that. And that was Israel's bottom line. But also at the same time, Israel was literally expanding its footprint even when there was peace being discussed, even before the Sueda events. That raised questions about its true intentions. Right after Assad was ousted in December in 2024, Israel wasted no time securing its interests on the ground. And 3 days after Assad's departure, Israeli forces moved past the UN-designated buffer zone in the Golan area known as the 1974 disengagement line. It incurred further into Syrian territory, and it was confirmed that by early 2025, Israel had built almost 6 military outposts inside the demilitarized zone, and not one inside the area, inside the Golan Heights. And Israeli tanks frequently rolled in and took positions in places that had been a no-go under the disengagement line. And Netanyahu justified this by declaring that the 1974 disengagement line was now void now that Assad has been toppled. So from day one, I think, of the new Syria, Israel treated the previous rules as null and void and established a new reality on the ground, effectively a unilateral buffer zone under Israeli oversight. And even locals, Syrian locals around the Golan Heights and the Al-Qunaitra governorate and throughout southern Syria complained of constant Israeli encroachment, checkpoints, arrests, roadblocks on Syrian soil. And although Israel initially claimed these incursions were temporary security measures, the fact is that Israel started constructing permanent military outposts and infrastructure, suggesting that it had intentions to stay. And combined with Israel's long-standing policy of expanding settlements in the occupied Golan Heights, which now, by the way, has over 50,000 Israeli settlers, these moves indicate that Israel was indeed solidifying control even as it talked for peace. So given this context, Rohan, I think one might say that Israel was buying time, using negotiations as a way to manage the situation while it strengthened its strategic position. So I would say that yes, Israel's desire for peace was real, but extremely conditional. It wanted a peace that enshrined Israel's security and territorial claims. If that could be achieved, it was pretty much great for Netanyahu. But if not, Israel prepared to continue a strategy of unilateral security measures. And many critics argued that Israel was simply stalling the talks while fortifying its hold on the Golan Heights. So I think that it was all a misstep. It was all a rush into these talks. I think that Syria has a lot more priorities to focus on rather than rush into talks with Israel. It has to show concessions on the stability and control over within its government, within its military, within its society, to prove to the Israelis that it is a partner that actually has cards to play, because the Israelis operating freely in Syrian airspace and Syrian territory really don't give the image that Syria right now is basically the right partner to be engaged in such a historic peace negotiation phase.
Abdullah, let's talk about a country that has the cards to play. Turkey or Turkey, they they've positioned themselves as both a mediator and a disruptor. I mean, they have backed al-Sharaa in Syria, and they vehemently oppose Netanyahu in Israel. What role do you think Ankara has in this situation?
Since Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been prime minister in 2003 and president in 2014, Turkey has played a highly dynamic role in the Middle East. And as you mentioned, as a mediator bridging conflicts, and at other times a disruptor pursuing its own geopolitical interests. And nowhere was this more evident than in Syria. Since the early days of the civil war, Turkey supported the Syrian opposition against many adversaries: Bashar al-Assad, ISIS, the Kurds, providing arms, funds, giving Syrian refugees refuge in Turkey. And during the 2010s, Ankara emerged as the chief patron of the rebel groups, like the Free Syrian Army, which later dissolved into multiple other groups. It also actually worked with Russia and Iran in the Astana process, effectively mediating local ceasefires while also carving out influence. And I think this paradox, pushing for peace in some venues while fighting its own battles, defines Turkey's regional policy. So, for example, Turkey hosted peace talks for Syrian factions, even as its army carried out incursions into northern Syria, such as Operations Euphrates Shield, Operation Olive Branch, etc., to drive out ISIS and Kurdish militias. But these actions disrupted the plans of both ISIS and the Kurdish YPG, basically reshaping the map along Turkey's border. So really, Turkey has never been a neutral bystander in terms of the Syrian conflict. It actively shapes outcomes, in fact. And in Syria's case, its long-standing support for the opposition paid off when al-Assad fell in December. The rebel factions that launched the lightning offensive in November were heavily supported by Turkey, and it played a key role in toppling the regime in that quick, fast-track offensive. So this instantly flipped Turkey's role from an antagonist in Damascus to a close ally of the new Damascus. And we did see Erdogan pivot to full support of Syria's interim government, and this basically made Turkey appear as the power behind the throne. We've heard many instances that say Turkey is a kingmaker, but I wouldn't go far to that extent. It basically disrupted the old order by aiding Assad's foes, and then it positioned itself as a central partner to build that new order. And since Assad fell, Turkey has doubled down on Syria's support and regrouping. It's not an exaggeration, honestly, to say that Ankara right now is one of the main foreign patrons of the post-Assad Syrian state. Turkey's foreign minister, Hakan Fidan, has shuttled to Damascus almost 4 to 5 times now. And that demonstrates Ankara's high-level engagement. Turkey pledged extensive support for Syria's reconstruction and security. Concretely, Ankara is helping to rebuild infrastructure and providing economic aid to Syria, facilitating the return of refugees, many other things. But more critically, Turkey is assisting in the reorganization of the Syrian security forces, the new Syrian military. Turkish officials openly say that they will train and advise Syria's new military and provide expertise to strengthen Syria's defenses. For instance, in recent talks, Turkish sources noted that they are assessing how to offer training, guidance, and technical aid to bolster the Syrian military. Just 2 weeks ago, there were numerous accounts on X, formerly Twitter, showing that there has been a convoy of Turkish-built armored personnel carriers going into Syria after delivery from Turkey. And they include a lot more. It includes small arms, vehicles. I think possibly it will include drones eventually. And of course, intelligence sharing to ensure that the new Syrian forces can secure the country. Just also 2 weeks ago, a report emerged that the Turkish intelligence forces thwarted 3 assassination attempts against President Ahmed al-Sharaa. So that's a very important factor to bolster the argument that Turkey really wants the Syrian government to survive. And all of what I just mentioned, it highlights Turkey's growing role in Syria. It wants to continue to invest that. It wants to prevent the dissolution of the Syrian state. It wants to keep its territorial integrity intact. And it has emphasized that. It is a core of Turkey's diplomatic language. And it does say that, preserving Syria's unity is paramount. And that is a stance, in my opinion, that aligns with its opposition to Kurdish secession and the general preference for strong central governments, at least those that are friendly to Ankara. So in that sense, Turkey is mediating between the new Syrian government, and in March 2025, Ankara actually brokered an agreement in which the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces are to integrate into the new Syrian state. Ankara played a very big role in that. So basically, Turkey told the Syrian Kurds, whom it views actually as terrorists, that it has to reconcile with Damascus or it is going to face a Turkish renewed offensive, new Turkish wrath. So this is mediation by leverage. Turkey coerced the SDF and persuaded Damascus to accept the deal by granting the Kurds a pathway into the national army and avoid war. So such actions actually position Turkey as a key power broker that basically knits Syria back together, even as it serves its own interest in weakening Turkish autonomy. So I think that pretty much sums up Turkey's role in the whole scene in Syria.
Yes, Abdullah, you've talked extensively about Israel, Syria, the back and forth, and now Turkey and the kind of role they've played both behind the curtains, but as well with Erdogan accepting al-Sharaa's interim government. So, of course, what's happening on stage as well. So Turkey has played a game both behind and at the front. My last question to you is this. The sectarian violence in Syria is very much a reality, and the tensions still persist. Yes, the Israel-Syria deal, ceasefire deal came close, but that's now been put on hold. That doesn't mean tensions within Syria have subsided. Do you think Syria is looking at a point where these divides would flare up even further? And do you think the country is possibly looking at breaking up on sectarian lines?
Most certainly, Rohan. There is indeed a real concern that Syria could fragment along sectarian lines, ethnic lines, given the deep divisions and chaos of the past decades. And we've seen this. We've seen alarming signs, sectarian clashes, warlordism, drug trafficking, human trafficking, regions slipping out of central control. In March, for example, militias that were basically in the process of integrating into the new Syrian government carried out a horrific massacre of Syrian Alawaites on the coast. About 1,500 died. And this sent shockwaves throughout Syria's minority communities. But more recently in July, those same militias who have been even further integrated into the Syrian military apparatus, were involved in the killings of Druze. So effectively, that was a major sign that is showing to the minorities and other groups in Syria that, the government is still not fully concentrated in maintaining its posture as an umbrella for everyone in Syria. I would say that fear is not far-fetched. Everyone is afraid in Syria who's not Sunni, essentially. And it could, if that keeps on escalating, we had the Alawite case in March, we had the Druze case in July. Who knows when the Kurdish case would be or the Christian case would be. Syria could, if that keeps on gaining a momentum, Syria could conceivably split into enclaves, into autonomous zones where we have a Druze semi-state in the south, an Alawite enclave on the coast, a Kurdish state in the northeast, and in the middle of all that, we have a Sunni Arab heartland. So the collapse of central authority often causes countries to splinter. And this model has been shown in Yugoslavia, in Libya. So I would say that Syrians right now, they worry about this balkanization. And quite frankly, this worries Syria's neighbors. But, personally, I believe that outright collapse right now is not inevitable. It can be averted. It can be very much averted if Syria's leadership under President al-Sharaa acts decisively to unify the country, to unify the factions in a just and inclusive manner. Sharaa's top priority should be national unification and reconciliation. In my view, he must prioritize his country's integration over any partisan, ethnic, vengeful agenda. That means avoiding any and all sectarian strife, both in rhetoric and in practice. His language has reflected that, I do have to give it to him, but his actions have not, especially in the Suwaida case. And his record thus has been mixed. He has promised to protect the minorities and be a unifying figure, but events like the March incident with the Alawaites and the Suwaida incident in July, they cast doubt, constant doubt, over the government's control over the hardline elements within the military. So to prevent collapse, al-Sharaa needs to assert strong command and control over his military and security forces. He is a former rebel commander. He has to rein in those fighters and any others who might act on sectarian vengeance. And a crucial element of that is that, commanders or militia leaders should not feel free to settle scores. If that keeps on expanding, Syria will splinter. And al-Sharaa needs to, I think he needs to purge or punish any officers who were involved and are planning to get involved in any sectarian atrocities or vengeful acts. This sends a clear message that such behavior will not be tolerated. And I believe that only by enforcing discipline and law can the state regain the trust of these traumatized minorities. But equally important, Syria's new government should focus on disarming and integrating non-government armed factions in their entirety, rather than trying to subjugate them or marginalize them. So this decade of war between multiple factions in Syria left, Syria teeming with militias. We have Kurdish militias, Syrian tribal militias, Druze militias, Iranian-backed Shia militias. If these groups remain armed and outside the state's infrastructure, they become seeds of future separatism and insurgency. And we've seen that in March by the Alawaites. They basically launched an insurgency. So I think a comprehensive disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program is imperative. I believe al-Sharaa should offer a grand reconciliation where he invites all non-state actors to lay down their arms in exchange for integration into the national army, into the law enforcement, with guarantees of fair treatment and local autonomy where appropriate. And the thing is, Sharaa has done that. He has, launched that initiative, and it has been supported by Tom Barrack, the U.S. envoy to Syria, but it has not gained fruit. Main obstacles to that happen to be the Syrian Democratic Forces. They're not budging. They're not giving in concessions that will push that effort forward. So I think ultimately Syria's fate hangs on whether its people and leaders choose unity over division. I personally do not believe the country is destined to break apart just yet right now. But despite everything, Syrians of different sects have lived together for centuries. And even after 14 years of horrific civil war, most Syrians are actually exhausted by conflict. And I don't think they would want any desire of further breakup. So, like I said earlier, I think with the wise policies focusing on integration, on disarmament, on equal protection for all communities, al-Sharaa can steer Syria away from the abyss of collapse, let's say.
Thank you, Abdullah. That was a very detailed and insightful conversation. And we'll keep tracking what's happening between Israel and Syria. And you'll have to come back and speak to us if there are some major developments, either that there is a possibility of increase in hostilities, or that the two sides actually agree to come and sign a peace agreement. Thank you so much, Abdullah, for joining.
Of course,
And
I'm very happy to be here, Rohan. I'm glad we talked about this subject. It's been a hotline for quite some while. And I look forward to our next conversation. Thank you very much.
thank you, Abdullah.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.